Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Abner and Roz Goldstine Scholar in Residence. First of all, before I introduce our Scholar in Residence this year, I want to once again thank Abner and Roz Goldstine for their unfailing generosity to the synagogue, among many, many, many other causes that they support, and for enabling us to bring really the best and brightest of the scholars in the world to come and address us each year and to enlighten and inspire us. And this year, I am delighted. I wish it could all be in person, but at least we get, nonetheless, the opportunity to learn from Rabbi Delphine Horvilleur, and she can correct my pronunciation. I hope she will. But she is France's third female rabbi, and also a leading light in French Jewish life, and increasingly in Jewish life worldwide. She's the editor of a journal in France, leads a congregation, and has written on a best-selling book on anti-Semitism in French, which is now available in English as well. And I hope that she will tell us not only about the book itself, but also about the condition of Jews in France. And we will talk about the condition of Jews in France and in America. And we'll have three opportunities to learn with Rabbi Delphine, as I'm going to conveniently call her, because it's so much easier for my untutored American tongue. And also, we will have the chance to have questions and comments. So please enter them in the chat, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook or on the Sinai streaming site, and I will be able to relay them so that we can make this as much of a communal learning experience as possible. And welcome. We are delighted to have you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you tonight here in Paris. I want to thank you for this invitation to spend these 3 sessions with you. Thank you especially to you, Rabbi Wolpe. When we met recently in Paris in Café de Flore, the existentialist coffee place in Saint-Germain, we discussed Sartre and philosophy and our rabbinic path, and I told you the source of inspiration you've been for me for all these years. So I'm really, truly grateful for this opportunity to have this dialogue.
Thank you so much.
I want to apologize in advance for my English, which is far from being perfect. So you might hear here and there elements of Franglish or even Franco-Hebrew-Glish words, kind of mixture of different languages, which is my specialty. And I might say also a word about that in a second. So maybe I'll start with that. I've lived in America between years 2003 and 2008. And I never miss an opportunity to say how much I owe to America and to the rabbinic training I received there in the seminary in New York a few years ago. I think that no other place could have placed me on this rabbinic journey. When I moved to New York in 2002, at the time, I'd never thought of becoming a rabbi. I'd grown up in France. I moved to Israel when I was 17. And both in Europe and in Israel, there was no possibility for me to even envision or dream of becoming a rabbi. I grew up in a rather traditionalist background in the east of France, in the Champagne area. And definitely the idea of a female rabbi was not part of my family story or DNA. And then I moved to Israel, and let's say that the idea there wouldn't have crossed my mind, maybe except as a kind of Michiganess. I was always interested in studying texts, but I had to first discover American Jewry to be able to verbalize the very ability to become a rabbi. And very often in America, people ask me why there are so few progressive rabbis and leaders in Jewish community in Europe, especially in France. And I think they are probably both historical and theological explanations for that phenomenon. And I would be really delighted to answer a question about that. Maybe if you want to discuss it then in our Q&A session, maybe tell you indeed a little bit more about the situation of French Jews and French Jewish institutions. Today we have 3 sessions actually to discuss that. But let me first tell you what I envision for a study session today and the coming days. As I said, I grew up in France and I received academic training both in Paris, in Jerusalem, and in New York. And the fact that I studied in 3 different countries, in 3 universities, in 3 different languages, taught me actually about the power of translation. And more precisely, what I should call the power of lost in translation. In my training and my experience, I very often witness the power of switching from one language to the other, and paradoxically, also the power of the lack of understanding and the impossibility to perfectly translate expressions or feelings from one language to another. And you can't imagine how many times in Israel and in America, because of my French background, I was victim of multiple misunderstandings. I thought I understood something, but the person in front of me absolutely didn't mean what I understood. And I mistook expressions and I charged them with other meanings. And I started to become obsessed with these misunderstandings and those moments that sometimes create the best jokes or funny moments in the world. I even considered at some point writing a book about situations of misunderstanding I encountered. I could give you 1,000 examples of that, but let me maybe give you 1 or 2 examples. I remember, for example, on the very first day at rabbinical school in New York, I had just moved to America and my English was even worse than what it is today. And on my first day of class, at rabbinic seminary, we had a Bible lesson, and our professor announced that he would have to skip the following class, and therefore he asked us instead to plan a makeup class. Well, for me at the time, makeup meant only one thing, like face foundation or lipstick or mascara. So you have to imagine my surprise when this older rabbi insisted on the fact that I needed to register for his makeup class. Well, I'm aware it's pretty ridiculous. So I'm going to share with you another example of rabbinical school misunderstandings or subjects of translations. One day, our liturgy professor, Rabbi Larry Hoffman, decided to make a little exercise of translation of the class. He wrote on the board 4 letters, P-A-I-N, and he simply asked my American classmates to mimic the word he just wrote on the board. And obviously they all pretended to be in pain, to be in terrible suffering. And then he turned to me because he knew French and he asked me to take part in the same game. And of course, P-A-I-N in French, pain, means bread. So I mimicked excitement and good appetite. And this little exercise was actually a perfect introduction to the Jewish art of interpretation. Exegesis, the rabbinic art of interpretation that we call in Hebrew midrash, is precisely based on the impossibility to clearly translate on multiple meanings of words, of expressions, and on the lacking elements of language and the need for every reader to kind of fill the void and translate in his or her language what the writer probably didn't exactly mean. And the very act of reading is in fact a lost in translation because you're not the writer. And even if you speak the writer's language, he might very well use specific words to express something that you would have expressed differently. And interpretation always depends, I think, on misunderstandings and missing elements and information, and the acknowledgement that two people actually never completely speak the same language. Even when they believe they speak the same language, even sometimes one person needs to translate in a new language what he or she used to say, but would say differently today. So the fact that I lived in between 3 different countries and 3 different languages for the past years created in me a kind of natural tendency to operate translations constantly. And I acknowledge that when I'm asked to give a lecture or to speak about pretty much anything, I tend to first translate that in another language, preferably in Hebrew, by the way, as if a journey to a foreign language could always offer keys of understanding. So this is actually a very long introduction to the themes of the sessions I decided to teach at Temple Sinai. I was told I could offer 3 classes, and I was asked to give a title for these 3 sessions. And as a good French citizen, immediately came to my mind the most famous French triptych, the most famous French conjunction of 3 words that you can read on almost every public institution or building: Liberté, Egalité, Fraternité, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. And this is the triptych of the promise of the French Republic, the promise that the Republic makes to all its citizens historically. But as you can imagine, in times of crisis, these notions are always interrogated and questioned, and people always wonder, are we able to keep the promise of freedom? Are we able to guarantee equality in our society? Is brotherhood just a vague and utopian dream? Or might we reach it someday? And again, because I believe that a journey through other languages and other worlds and narratives is always the straightest path to one's self-understanding. So I decided it might be interesting to study with you these notions, to study these notions not only in comparison to what they mean or are expressed in American society, but mainly to take you through a detour and a journey, maybe through Hebrew etymology, through Jewish culture and rabbinic literature. So today we will study and we will dive into the notion of freedom for French, American, and rabbinic culture. And our next session will be dedicated to the notion of equality. And the final study, we will dive into brotherhood issues, maybe the most difficult notion, I believe, to create in a society. So let's talk about freedom now. In French, freedom, we call it liberté. I think in English you have 2 words that don't exactly mean the same, liberty and freedom. So in France, when you ask people in the street, let's say you stop someone in the street here in Paris, and you ask people, what is the face of freedom? What picture or painting represents it at the best? I believe that most people will think about a painting that I will try now to share with you. This one, yeah, I think you can, no? I don't think you can see it now. It worked before when we rehearsed. Yeah, I'm gonna share with you my screen. Yes, I think now you're gonna see it. Yeah. I hope you can see now the picture. You see here, it's a very famous picture by Delacroix called La Liberté guidant le peuple, freedom leading the people. You can see in the background of this picture, Notre Dame on the right side of the picture, Notre Dame de Paris. You see young people protesting in the street, revolution. And you see this central character, this woman called Liberté, incarnating that freedom, leading people with a naked breast. It represents her ability to feed the nation. It represents the fact that she's able to be a nurturing force, and she incarnates Liberté. She has her arm above her head. She's the symbol of power. Now, I guess if you ask the same question in America, what is the representation of freedom or liberty, you might be led, obviously, to another piece of art, another sculpture that, well, it's not going to be a big surprise. You will discover it now. This sculpture is the Statue of Liberty. Here the picture is taken in France, in Paris. It's the French version of the Statue of Liberty, because as you probably remember, the Statue of Liberty is a present from the French government to America. But you see the same pattern you recognize here. Freedom is represented by a woman. It's represented by a woman. The American version is not naked. Maybe American society is more Puritan, I don't know. But you see that this woman is again raising her arm above her head, and this time to bring light to the world. But in both cases, I find interesting that the symbol of freedom is carried by a woman, and it might appear as maybe counterintuitive, because in traditional societies, and definitely at the time those sculptures or paintings are made, patriarchy is strong, and one might suppose that men represent freedom, or have more freedom in society than women. But leave it aside for a second, and maybe now let's move on to Hebrew and to rabbinic literature. Let's consider what might be the figure of freedom in the biblical narrative, the image of liberation or liberator. Well, it's very, very easy to say and to find. You simply need for that to open the book of Exodus, the book of freedom from slavery, freedom from Egypt. And more specifically, you might think about the enunciation of the 10 Commandments, Mount Sinai, Aseret HaDibrot. You know, at the very moment the revelation occurs, the central revelation of the Bible takes place on the top of Mount Sinai, facing an entire people who just left Egypt and barely experienced the status of free men or women. God appears in a voice and presents himself in the following manner. You probably remember this very famous sentence. And the first commandment, the first dibrot, the first word, Anochi Hashem Elohecha, Asher Hotzeticha, Me'eretz Mitzrayim, Mibet Avadim, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. And as you see here, we have to pay attention to this introduction, because God could have easily said, I am the Lord your God who created the universe. Or he could have said, I am the one who made a covenant with your ancestors. Or he could have said, I'm the one who talked to Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, etc., etc. But the identity of the divine here is emphasized from the first commandment as an identity of liberation, of liberator. Our God at Sinai is a God who frees us as a people. It's the liberty guiding the people, but obviously it has no image. It's guiding the people not with a flag, not with a torch, but through a voice towards freedom and towards the promised land. And those words are enunciated as a voice, but also, and that's specific to the 10 Commandments, those words are, as you know, engraved on a stone. If you want, they are sculpted in the stone. This is what the Torah says. We are now in chapter 32 in the book of Exodus. In verse 16, we read this famous verse, Ve'aluchot ma'aseh Elohim ema, the tablets are the work of God. Ve'amichtav, michtav Elohim hu, and the writing is the writing of God. Charut al aluchot, graven upon the tablet. And the interesting thing is that the declaration of freedom and liberation in the biblical literature is engraved and then supposedly fixes in the stone the promise of freedom. So it prevents the word itself from being totally free, from, if you want, from hanging in the air. And I don't know if you perceive here the paradox. Freedom in the rabbinic literature is engraved in the stone, doesn't hang freely in the air, just like a pure speech. And by the way, later on, many declarations of freedom and independence, both in France and America, will follow the same pattern, even symbolically. These representations are often made like that. It's probably a picture you're also familiar with. This is the Déclaration des droits de l'homme, the declaration of the citizen's rights, a declaration of freedom of the citizen, is represented exactly in the same biblical pattern, as if it was copying in the way, an imitation of the way we envision the classical representation we have of the Idgalut, the representation on Mount Sinai, as if the biblical moment of revelation was the epitome of freedom promises all along history. But the rabbis seem to be aware of the paradox I just noted. Freedom is promised on Mount Sinai on a stone and seems to be rigidified on a material support. How can freedom be represented as a petrified element? And the rabbinic answer is given by the sages in a very famous midrash, through a very famous play on words, through a kind of fake lost in translation. You probably remember the verse I just quoted before, the verse from Exodus 32, chapter 16, verses 16 in this chapter. Ve'aluchot ma'aseh Elohim ena, the tablets were God's work and the writings was God's writing. Charut al aluchot, you see here the word charut, which is the word that interests me particularly. Charut al aluchot. It happens that this word in Hebrew, charut, chet resh vav taf, has a double meaning. It means both freedom and engraved. Engraved and freedom, charut and cherut, are the same word in Hebrew. So in a famous midrash in Pirkei Avot, there is this teaching that you probably already heard. The rabbis teach us in this Mishnah, Al tikra charut ela cherut. Don't read that verse of Exodus as engraved or graven, the tablets are graven, but read it as cherut, as freedom. The law is not engraved on stone, but it's freedom on the tablet. And you understand here the huge rabbinic chutzpah at play. The sages tell us the tablets are not graven, the law is not engraved, but what is engraved is the commandment of freedom. And they play with etymology using this ancient tool of al tikra ela. Do not read what seems to be written, but dare to read something that is not written. And the sages invite us to misread the verse, to make sure we read it properly. And this is actually their very definition of freedom. Their definition of freedom is, above all, freedom of interpretation, a midrashic freedom that is at the core of their sacred activity. And the biblical character who will be the perfect incarnation in their eyes of this rabbinic chutzpah is Moses himself. You probably remember, as he brings down to the people the sacred tablets with engraved words of God, the first thing he will do is to crush them, to break them. And the breaking of the tablets is the very condition of the exercise of freedom and freedom of interpretation. Now, to understand it, we need to go back for a second to the etymology, to the root of the word, the Hebrew word for freedom, the one I just quoted now. Cherut, cherut in Hebrew, freedom, comes from a word, chor, chet, vav, resh in Hebrew. You probably know this word for different reasons. Maybe you know this word, chur, or chor, if you watch once this movie, this one, huge success in France, I'm sure it was also in America, the movie Ben-Hur, Ben-Hur, maybe you say in English, I don't know, this movie where Charlton Heston played a very famous part. Well, this word Ben-Hur is actually a Hebrew name, which literally means the son of Hur, the son of freedom. You remember that Charlton Heston in this movie plays a gladiator who wants to gain freedom, cherut. But you also know this Hebrew root, chor, if you ever attended a seder of Pesach, of Passover. When we sit around the table in Pesach, we keep repeating and singing, Avadim ayinu, we were slaves, Ata bnei chorin, and now we are children of chur. We translate it generally, now we are free people, but literally we say we are children of chur, or children of chor, and chor in Hebrew literally means a hole, a void. So the best translation in English or in French for the Hebrew word free, ben chor, is actually to say that it defines what carries a hole in it, what has a void in it. If you want, the best image of chur is a bagel. Freedom in the Hebrew language depends on what is engraved in the stone, meaning what has been taken out of the stone, what is missing in the stone to produce engravement, and freedom is conditioned by a void, just like a bagel. It is defined by the fact that it's not full. Freedom is never, in Hebrew, a state of fullness and plenitude. And I think it's a very important point to consider, because for our modern societies, it's definitely counterintuitive. People in our modern societies tend to believe that freedom is a state of integrity, of plenitude. People will say that they are free because they believe that no one is imposing anything on them. No one steps into your territory to violate your space. Or to create any kind of rupture or any kind of void in it. My freedom, it's true in Europe, and maybe it's particularly true in America, is linked to a certain respect of private property, a certain sense of unbreached territory, fullness, and unbroken frontiers. But in Hebrew, it's almost the opposite. Metaphorically, etymologically, freedom depends upon your ability to experience brokenness and to experience void in oneself. And this is by excellence the experience of the Hebrew people when they leave Egypt. You know, when they leave Egypt, they abandon a place where people worship a solar disk. So a figure of plenitude, the god Ra, the sun, the solar god, and idolatry for the rabbi is always associated with the cult of full round shapes of plenitude, This is the meaning actually of the word egel za'av in Hebrew. The golden veil literally means in Hebrew egel za'av, the golden circle. This is the figure of idolatry in the Bible. When the Israelites are free, they're asked to stop worshiping fullness. And immediately what happens? Moses breaks the tablets engraved and written by God. And Judaism will keep repeating all along its history, through its narratives and its rites, will keep repeating gestures of brokenness, uncompletedness. In so many narratives and phenomena and rites, the temples are broken, the matzah is broken as we start the Seder, the Brit, the alliance, is always cut. A marriage is obviously sealed through broken glass, etc., etc. The Hebrew notion of freedom is an anti-idolatry, and it's always linked to an ability to deal with what is broken in our life, with what is missing in our existence, what is no more, and to make sure that the system leaves room for otherness. In our societies that cherish freedom, we tend to forget precisely this. The others are often perceived as the ones who prevent us from being truly free. The others actually enable us to create a precious void in ourselves, as they bringing new languages and new understandings, and the possibility of multiple meaning, and the possibility of misunderstanding, and the possibility of renewed meaning in our life. All this is the condition of freedom, I believe, according to the rabbis. And maybe I will stop here with this notion, with this idea. It will be my conclusion, and we can engage in a Q&A or dialogue sessions. I hope my English was understandable, or maybe I hope it was not understandable completely. This way, this level of misunderstanding leaves us true freedom of interpretation. Thank you.
Yes, the brokenness is always. So that was a wonderful and deep, and I think an important opening to our continuing dialogue over the next week. I have a couple of quick comments. First of all, you started off by talking about self-knowledge and dreams, which struck me because each week I write a Torah column for the Jerusalem Post, and this coming week, which is Toldot, I talk about how does Jacob, when he wakes up, all of a sudden know that there's a God in this place? And the answer that I gave was the Hasidic answer, which is, V'anochi lo yadati, I didn't know myself. And by coming to know himself, he comes to understand that there's God, which was the first thing you said. That was exactly. The second I wanted to say is the idea of a woman being the symbol of freedom. You could actually even go back to the beginning of the Torah, because it's Eve that reaches for the fruit. She's the one who wants freedom, more even than Adam does. So it could be the original symbol of the searching for freedom. And then the third is, it's clear to me that you spent time in New York, because the idea that freedom is a bagel instead of a croissant seems to me very, very American, very New York.
It's a betrayal to my culture.
That's right. And the Kotzker Rebbe sort of said so beautifully, I think, what your lesson teaches us, which is that the only whole heart is a broken one. Mm-hmm. That in brokenness is that freedom. Yeah. So I guess I want to bring the lesson now to the current situation and ask you, what for Jews do you think is the state of freedom in our broken world today? And over the course of your life in France, has that changed? I think most American Jews would say that there's been a clear change in America as relates to Jews and freedom. But I wonder if that's true in France.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm happy you're bringing this Anochi lo yadati, which is, indeed, I could have used this example precisely in what I just discussed. I think that Jacob in the Bible represents always the identity of someone who is almost himself. Like Jacob, when he's born, he has this twin brother, Esau. And Esau, as you know, his name is a past participle. Like Esau means in Hebrew, already made. Like he's born hairy. He represents this identity of someone who has always been what he was. You know, Esau is born the way he will always be. He will know no evolution. He's kind of always faithful to his origin, to what he will be. And Jacob is exactly the opposite. Jacob is the one who is becoming. I mean, his name carries the letter of the future in Hebrew, this beginning youth that supposedly creates a new beginning, like the idea of possibility of the future. And we know he will always become someone else. He doesn't know exactly who he is. Anochi lo yadati, I don't know Anochi, I don't know who I am, and he will become Israel, but still will be called Jacob, and he's the one who is oscillating, limping, he will be limping actually, is the limping identity. And I believe it's no mystery that Jewish identity has something to do with this dilemma, the fact that we're never able to be in an Esau identity. We are always in a Jacob identity, in a kind of limping, limping identity. No one is able to say what the Jewish identity relies upon, and it's always a process of standing in between belongings, in between identity, and I think this is probably what we can also bring today to the world. I think it's true in America, but it's particularly true in Europe today. We go through very strong identity crisis. We have in the political discourse so many people around us who are obsessed with what I would call Esau manifestation of their identity. They are convinced that they need to be faithful to what they were at the beginning, to go back to a kind of original recipe of what nationalism teaches us, of what history teaches us. And I think that Jews are always in trouble when this voice of Esau is very strong in the political discourse. It's very strong also in the fundamentalistic religious discourse, this obsession of faithfulness to origins and faithfulness to history. So I think that today this dialogue between Esau and Jacob is kind of exactly what our societies are going through. And I think that we should always listen carefully to these tendencies in our society. We try to define us as a kind of an obsessive mode with the origins.
I think that's a really very beautiful and biblically rooted way of approaching it. I want to just summarize it and tell me if I'm capturing your meaning correctly, so that when you see nativism, nationalism, people insisting on an inflexible identity that has to do with roots, that almost always means trouble for the Jewish people. And the same thing is true of fundamentalist religions, that when they look at Jews, it almost always means trouble as well.
Yeah, because I think anti-Semitism, this is one of my theses in my book about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has always something to do with a fear of someone who prevents you from being truly yourself. You know, when an individual or a group or a society becomes obsessed with authenticity and the fear that it lacks purity, or someone or like an agent is preventing him from being truly himself, the way its origins meant him to be. So you can be pretty sure that very fast, the Jew will be the name, the coded name of what prevents that person or that society to be truly itself. You know, anti-Semitism always goes hand in hand, we know, with conspiracy theories, but also with obsessions of purity, with obsessions of authenticity and integrity. When people are convinced it's exactly what I was teaching about now, about the rabbis perceive idolatry as being an obsession with complete shapes.
Right.
When you're not able to deal with brokenness in your world, with changing pure elements of even, let's say it, contamination, the fact that life movement has to do with contamination, with fertilization, with encounter with the other that will change you. If you're willing to avoid that encounter, and if you're convinced that this encounter with otherness will threaten you, so you can be pretty sure that the anti-Semitic language is already speaking through you, And I witnessed this in France today very, very often. I don't know if you followed in the news, for example, so many demonstrations against vaccination here in France. So many demonstrations of the yellow jackets. I don't know if you followed in America, the pattern of contestation against Macron. Those elements of social contestation, for some weird reason, at some point, started to speak anti-Semitic slogans. And many people said, how is it that on the side of the anti-vax demonstration, we suddenly hear anti-Semitic slogans? How is it that on the side of yellow jackets demonstrations, suddenly we hear classical anti-Semitic rhetorics? People are surprised, but it's actually not surprising, because those demonstrations, even though, it's totally legitimate to demonstrate in a democracy, but the moment you start to believe that, you have a certain idea of a certain fear of otherness in society, contamination and brokenness, very, very easily, you open the very ancient Pandora box of anti-Semitic language.
So this is a good chance to remind people that your book, Reflections on the Question of Anti-Semitism, is translated into English. You can find it on Amazon, as I did. And so that's, if you want to learn more, and it's very source rich. It really goes to what the Jewish tradition has to say through its long history about this. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, since you're part of what is called the progressive movement in France, in the United States, there's a great deal of concern in the Jewish community about the statements of progressives here about Israel and sometimes about Jews and Judaism. So I wonder if you see that on the left as well as the right in France, or how you take this analysis and apply it to that question.
Well, on that matter, the situation is pretty different here in Europe, and especially in France, because our history is different. I think I think generally speaking, French Jewry stands more on is very, very supportive of Israel, and I think most French Jews define themselves as very Zionist today, very attached to Israel. As you probably know, with the rise of anti-Semitic threats, especially since the beginning of year 2000, the wave of Aliyah grew. It's very difficult to give numbers. Very often people ask numbers of Aliyah of French Jews to Israel. I personally know many people, many French Jews who took Israeli citizenship but decided to stay in France. So as you see, those numbers are very difficult to define, because many French Jews didn't move to Israel, but in recent years strengthened their link to Israel, sometimes bringing them to take Israeli citizenship. I think that the French Jewish history in recent years has been mainly impacted by the wave of anti-Semitism and terror attacks toward Jews at the beginning of the year 2000. As you know, and maybe I'll talk more about this in the coming sessions, beginning of year 2000, there was clearly a strong wave of anti-Semitism in France, and it took quite a while for the public power, politicians and the media here to be able to verbalize where this anti-Semitism was coming from, and to even use the word anti-Semitism. You know, they were talking about a kind of import of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of tensions between communities, etc., etc. But there was a kind of delay, a language delay, really I would say a brokenness of language. It was hard for many people to be able to acknowledge that anti-Semitism was on the rise, and many French Jews felt at the time a true loneliness. And it left many, I think it left a large part of the French community, French Jewish community, in a kind of state of trauma, you know, which we feel today as impacts. You know, we are now, for example, starting a presidential race. There will be presidential elections very soon in May. And there is a candidate here from the extreme right called Eric Zemmour.
Who's Jewish.
Yeah, is Jewish. All the newspaper talk about him and about his Jewish identity. The fact that for the very first time, an extreme right candidate, clearly from the right of the extreme right, is Jewish and claims he's Jewish. And the fact that part of the Jewish community is sensitive to his arguments seems totally crazy. But at the same time, you can't understand this phenomenon if you don't take into consideration what French Jews went through for the past 20 years and the impact that left on their psyche, a certain feeling of divorce from traditional French promises of the République.
So do you feel in France anti-Semitism of the left, or do you think that it's almost exclusively on the right?
No, I think anti-Semitism comes from everywhere. And it would be very naive to believe that one anti-Semitism is more relevant or threatening or dangerous than the other. And I think on both sides of the ocean, we should really be careful on not minimizing the threat coming from one political side or the other. I think today we clearly see that there is a kind of echo chamber.
And what changed? I mean, when I began the rabbinate, which was before you, but nonetheless, when I began being a rabbi, honestly, anti-Semitism played a very small part in the consciousness of American Jews. We knew of it as a historical phenomenon, but not as so much as a contemporary one. Now, everyone, right and left, feels it as a contemporary phenomenon. So what changed?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, when I studied in New York in year 2003 or 4, I clearly remember those conversations with my colleagues in New York. They used to tell me, how is the state of anti-Semitism in France? We're so worried for you. And then they would always add this sentence that I was getting crazy with that sentence. So often they would tell me it would never happen in America. And indeed, there was like this clear consciousness that it would never happen in America. And to me, it was clear as a French woman who grew up in France in the 80s, the 90s. You know, I grew up in a France where clearly, when I was a child, I was convinced that anti-Semitism wouldn't be my fight. It wouldn't be the fight of my generation because the Shoah was so close to us. It took place exactly on the grounds I was standing upon. You know, I grew up in the east of France. There was this consciousness of the devastation of the war and the Shoah. And I was clearly convinced until the 90s that this wouldn't be the fight of my generation. And then something switched slowly, you know, in the 1990, the cemetery of Carpentras in the south of France was desecrated. And then beginning of year 2000, you probably remember Ilan Halimi, a young Parisian Jew, is tortured, kidnapped, tortured, assassinated, and then Toulouse, and then this wave where it became obvious that not only this fight would be a fight for our generation, but it would probably be again the war we would have to engage in. So I think it's never over, because it has always to do, anti-Semitism doesn't teach anything about the Jews. It always says something about the anti-Semitic mind, and the anti-Semitic mind keeps, muting and getting stronger. Each time a society, again, I believe, is facing questions of fear of change, fear of taking responsibility. Also, I think anti-Semitism has a lot to do with the fear of taking responsibility. And it's always the Jew becomes the figure of, what happens to me without my responsibility. If I'm suffering of something and it has nothing to do with my responsibility, someone must be in charge. And the Jew is the manipulating agent always. And this rhetoric doesn't belong to the extreme right. It also very often heard in the extreme left. It's definitely heard in religious fundamentalism, because...
So that's what I want to jump on, is the religious fundamentalism, because one of our questions from YouTube from Jennifer Malvin is, and this you'll probably speak more about with Rabbi Guzik on Tuesday, but what about from within the Jewish community? Religious fundamentalism in our own community, surely as a female rabbi in France who's given this, not only had a lot of experience with it, but given it a lot of thought. So I wonder, do you see differences between the way Jews become rigid or fundamentalist and the way other traditions do, or is it the same phenomenon?
No, I believe it's exactly the same phenomenon. It doesn't have the same consequences. I feel for the past 15 years as a French female rabbi, I received many letters of, hate mails and whatever, so often, but I never got, threatened, by, frankly, the consequences are not the same. I don't get murder threats or something, but indeed there is a very strong resistance to what appears within the group to be threatening the frontiers and the porosity of the group. And again, when the group itself is obsessed with its frontier, with its purity, integrity, remaining the same as it was always, and you know it, and I know it historically, Judaism is, as a tradition has always been impacted by otherness and encounters with others, but there is always this tendency to keep like a pure narrative of non-contamination by the other. And each time we become obsessed with this narrative, so indeed all the forces that represent a kind of porosity of the system are perceived to be a threat. And definitely that's the case of progressive Jews, and definitely that's the case of women. Women are the perfect symbol for that. This is actually the problem our traditions have with femininity, is the fact that femininity always represents porosity in the system, always represents the openness to an encounter with the other. So it's no big mystery that indeed we suffer from the same pattern inside the Jewish family, inside the Jewish group. I think that this obsession with authenticity and purity is clearly touching us also, and it's also sometimes touching a certain, I would say, Zionist discourse. And I say this as a Zionist myself. I lived in Israel for many years. This is a very important part of my life, but I have to say that very often today I'm struck by a certain Zionist discourse of authenticity and purity and fear of contamination that actually builds exactly, for me, on the same patterns with what strengthens anti-Semitism and fear of others pretty much everywhere in the world,
So this is a delicate subject, but an important one to talk about. One of the fear of others, certainly in the Jewish community, and I think this is more true in France. You spoke about France being a little ahead of us in terms of anti-Semitism, is coming from the anti-Semitism that is bred in the Middle East and then is exported with Islamic immigrants to Europe and to the United States. And I think that this is an increasing problem in Europe. And some wonder whether this will be the same or different in the United States, or some have diagnoses that it already is. How do you think about the Islamic population of France, and what can you teach us about it being, as I said, a few years ahead of us?
Well, what happened in France is that for many years, the fight against racism and against anti-Semitism was fought together. I probably also like this in the States, but in France it was really clear in the year, I don't know, in the 80s or 90s, that we were struggling together against anti-Semitism and against racism. The activism was joint. And then something happened in the year 2000, which has to do with the fact that part of the left here, mainly in France, part of the left was unable to name the phenomenon of anti-Semitism when it was coming from Muslim population, or population who were discriminated and who were racially attacked. So, this suddenly created, again, a fail of language, because people were not able to name the anti-Semitism when it was coming from people who suffered from racism. And we know this is exactly where we stand today, 20 years later. We are still in this moment of décalage, where there is no reconciliation today between people, and that's terrible. That's a nightmare, actually. There is no reconciliation between the fights, and we don't seem to find a way to reconciliate these fights, which needs to be fought together, obviously.
On the Facebook page, Randy Skirk asked, what role did the Durban conference play? Was that in 2001? Was that a significant event in the life of French Jewry?
Well, I think it was not really significant. I mean, it was a terrible and a catastrophic event, obviously. But I think for me, this was not the turning moment for French Jewry. I think really the turning moment were more the dates that I quoted before. I would say, 1990, Carpentras Cemetery is desecrated. Hundreds of thousands of French citizens go to the street. It's a huge moment. Even Mitterrand at the time, the French president, was demonstrated in the street. But then 15 years go through. 2006, Ilan Halimi is assassinated. And I remember myself standing in the demonstration that day, looking around me, and suddenly I noticed that most of the people in the street around me are Jews. So suddenly, 15 years went by, and suddenly it became a Jewish problem, And
right.
Then the epitome, the acceleration of this history is probably 2012, when children are assassinated in front of their school in Toulouse with their father. 3 kids are killed, and the father, a teacher, 2012, and then there is no demonstration. Like France doesn't doesn't go to the street. The French, it's as if there is like this moment of absolute mutism. And until today, French Jews, and I'm part of these people, we don't understand what happened. What happened in 2012 that didn't let hundreds of thousands and million people to the street. Then, as you probably remember, comes 2015, Charlie Hebdo attack, and the hyper kosher grocery store attacked. And then again, millions of people come to the street. But for French Jews, the little voice inside our head in that moment tells us very strongly something clear, that if only the grocery store had been attacked and not Charlie Hebdo, there would be no one.
Right.
We know it because 3 years earlier, we were kind of alone. So this story of loneliness, experienced loneliness, is maybe, and I'm sorry to sound so pessimistic, but it's maybe where we are a bit ahead of what happened
because when Squirrel Hill was attacked, in fact, the whole world reacted. America reacted. Every politician was there. But as this continues, when you see, for example, some attacks on the ultra-Orthodox in Brooklyn, that you don't get the same kind of reaction, and I fear that could be the case with future events, if God forbid they should happen in the United States. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so I would like to bring us back to the central lesson that you want to teach this morning, which is really about freedom, liberté, or liberty. So in America, we think that we have, invented liberty. Nobody thought of it before we did. Before the bell, there really was no such thing. But what is both as a Jew and also as in France, because again, the revolutions were different. What is it that we can take tangibly from this sense of the brokenness of liberty and the way in which we have to practice it in our own lives, both to understand ourselves, but also to stand up against those that would take it away from us?
Well, it's interesting, as you say, the French Revolution and the American ones were pretty different, and it teaches a lot about how change happens in each country. Actually, I very often think that, and it's terrible actually for the French side, but that the change in France always happen when you cut heads. Here people here are somehow impacted by the French Revolution in a way that reform and change is always happens in a kind of social violence in a way. But what I wanted to teach today, but I think is something we should meditate on both sides of the ocean, is the fact that I see all around us how much people are attached to this notion of their freedom, but seem to associate this notion with really, again, a lack of threat on their frontiers. People are so convinced that their freedom has something to do with a lack of fertilization by the other, contamination and counter, a kind of protected sphere of the unchanged in your life. And I find it very striking and inspiring that Jewish thought seems to teach the opposite, that actually coming out of slavery always implies that you are willing to deal with the incomplete and the changing elements of yourself. To hear this call of Anochi that you were talking about a few minutes ago, in Hebrew, you can say I, first person singular, in two ways. You can say Ani, or you can say Anochi. And our sages teaches us that Anochi is a bit higher than Ani. But when you write Anochi, actually you write Aleph, Nun, Chaf, Yud, which actually means you write Ani, I, but you add this little letter, the little Chaf in the word, that in Hebrew means almost. Okay? Something in Hebrew means almost. So when you write Anochi, you actually write in Hebrew that you are almost I, almost yourself. And I think we should really meditate on this capacity we have to be almost ourselves, almost convinced that we are right, and this little décalage leaves room for some doubt. And I think this is the recipe of freedom.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. We hope that you will all join us to learn more. Tuesday at noon. We look forward to seeing you, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you, Rabbi. It's wonderful to.
Thank you.